Hello, in this video I'm going to be looking at the Titan Strife. This tank very sneakily just released today in a new type of container called the Massive Lucky 8. Of course, Wargaming didn't give the tank to us contributors early, again, so I had to gamble a few crates to try and get it, and I luckily managed to get it. This tank only has a 5% drop chance, so I definitely say, unless you really want one of these other tanks in the crates, then I would say it's not worth it. However, 8,500 gold for a tier 8 tank is a completely normal price, so these containers are actually not a bad deal. Plus, on top of that, you get other containers with it, an attachment, the legendary camo, and of course a 5% chance at this tank. So for these containers, when they do drop the Titan Strife, they drop that on top of another vehicle. So when they drop the Titan, you get two tanks. It's not its own drop, since this crate does guarantee one tank. But yeah, that's how you get it. And it is an intentional release, it's not accidental, just because it says literally in the description how to get this tank. But anyway, Titan Strife. So this is a tier 8 Hybrid Nation heavy tank, and of course, like the other Titans, it has the dynamic armor consumable, just like the Titan Charioteer and the Titan 54D. So these tanks, of course, they all got the same sort of mechanic, where when you activate this consumable, armor slides out from somewhere on the tank, giving it extra protection. You also absorb 10% more damage, so enemies' damage is 10% lower. But basic overview of the tank, let's get into the stats. So let's get into the stats of the tank. There is not a review on my website yet, just because Wargaming has released this tank without saying anything, without giving us the tank early to, make reviews of. So there's not a review on my website yet, but there will be one later today because I'll be working on it after this. But I've done the basic sections just to be able to give a review now, just because making a video is much faster than typing it all into the website. But looking at the armor here, it is against 225 standard ammo, 225 AP, which is standard ammo in tier 8, and you can see it has very strong upper plate armor with very strong turret front armor, though a few weak points which are notable. That light is actually a weak point, it's not just cosmetic, you can go right through it. It is 170 to 180 millimeters thick, so when you do face this tank, do try and shoot the light, because it's one of the only weak points on the upper plate. Other than this, there are some small areas next to the gun which are penetrable, and of course this sort of rocket launcher at the back of the turret, which is also weak. However, just due to where it is, it's hard to hit, and I wouldn't say that going for that is something you should do. Next, you can see there's this sort of shoulder plate on the side when the hull is turned, which is slightly weak. However, only when the hull is turned, so when it is facing front, it's not weak at all. It's also just a bit harder to go for than this light, so I would say, unless you're using premium ammo, there's not too much point, just because it is slightly red. And also this tank using enhanced armor in these images. So now let's say we activate the armor. You can see what changes. That weak shoulder area has now been strengthened with a spaced armor plate, and of course the light weak points on the front of the hull has now been removed. But other than this, nothing changes. The lower plate is still weak, the turret front has not got any extra protection. The only areas that have are the upper plate and the sides, which really don't make much of a difference. Also, one thing I forgot to mention, this lower plate, because it is slightly a pike shape, when you do angle the hull, the further bit of the lower plate does become quite strong. But you can see not much difference when activating the armor. So, next, against premium ammo, what does it look like? You can see the front of the turret has some more weak points now. These are 245mm thick, or 252 if you use enhanced armor. You are able to remove these weak points by turning the turret, as you can see here, so I definitely recommend you to turn the turret to bounce those premium ammo shots. There is also a weak area on the turret ring, which means even if you turn the turret it is still weak. However, that is better than most of the turret, so it's also quite small and hard to hit. One other thing you'll notice, the upper plate isn't even weak against premium ammo. Only when you turn the hull it becomes weak. So as long as you face your hull front to the enemies, you don't even need to activate your armor, which is something very nice on this tank. But it also brings in the question, why do I even need that armor? Because all it does is make it stronger against premium ammo when the hull is turned. A fairly niche situation. So you can see the difference here against premium ammo. It does just make the part of the hull, when you angle it, it makes that closest upper plate stronger, which is useful when you face multiple enemies, or you know, the enemy has gotten to your side and you can't turn the hull fast enough to angle to them, but it is still quite a niche situation. But what you need to know about the upper plate armor, 280 to 290mm thick, which does allow you to bounce nearly all tier 8 premium ammo, and when you activate the armor it goes up to 460mm thick, which is very good. The turret front, weakest point 245mm thick, and the lower plate 140 at its weakest. So its overall armor is not bad. It is quite good. However, what's the point of the dynamic armor consumable is the question. One other thing to note, this tank has good side armor. It's also got thick tracks. So you can see here, tracks are 35mm thick compared to the usual 20. It is very nice. But you do have to note, there is this area which will be penetrable, and of course the closest upper plate to premium ammo will become penetrable. So when you side scrape, it's probably best to try and use your consumable. And the difference between activating and not activating the consumable, you'll see it's not too much. Just the upper plate and the hull sides gain a few armor plates, but in terms of its actual impact on battle, it's not the biggest. Next, the gun is a 105, which is pretty normal for tier 8. However, it's got very nice alpha damage, 340 on AP, 290 on heat, and 430 on HE, sort of similar to a Kyler. However, unlike the Kyler, it has very good reload, 9 seconds, giving it 2300 DPM, which most tanks with 340 alpha or 350 would have less DPM than similar 105mm guns, which have 310 alpha in tier 8, but this one doesn't have reduced DPM, which gives it a pretty nice combination. Penetration 218 on standard is decent, not great, not terrible though. Heat 290, which is amazing, and HE 65, also very good. That heat penetration is really nice. It's more like a tier 9 tank, and it allows you to go through almost anything that you face. Aim time is not terrible, 3.8/4.1, especially for 340 alpha damage. Base aim time is also pretty decent. However, its dispersion is fairly mediocre at 0.362. However, for 340 alpha damage, it's not the worst. Gun handling is also fairly mediocre, but also it's not the worst. You do notice it in battle. It doesn't feel like an accurate gun at all. It feels fairly inaccurate. But that's to be expected considering you have pretty good DPM and good alpha damage. So shell velocity is 950 on AP, which is good, and 700 on heat and HE, which aren't great, but you aren't using those shells as often, so not the worst. Gun depression is the biggest issue on this tank, and it is 6 degrees. The reason it is such a bad thing on this tank is because how high the gun is mounted on the vehicle. It's right at the very top. And also this is not a small tank. Compare it to the Kyler, which is a very large German heavy tank. It is only slightly shorter than it. Whoops, that is not the... but yeah, you can see the difference. It's not too much. This is a very large, very tall tank, and you'll notice that when you try to use gun depression in battle. But overall, the gun is not terrible because it has a very nice combination of damage and DPM. It's got great penetration, and while its accuracy and all that isn't the best, it's still usable. Next, mobility. Speed is 32. That is decent considering its armor profile, but fairly slow overall for a heavy tank. 13 in reverse, also decent, but fairly slow overall, considering many heavies can have 14 or 15 kilometers, which does actually make a difference. Traverse, 32.6 on hard terrain, which is decent. It's not terrible at all. However, 25 on medium terrain is very slow, and you definitely notice that in-game. The in-game acceleration is 12.3, which is decent. The tank weighs 63 tons with an almost 800 horsepower engine. However, despite this decent level of acceleration on hard terrain, on medium terrain it is very slow. Well, fairly slow at 9.5 horsepower per ton. Combined with this slow traverse speed, it really feels quite immobile, quite sluggish, and you get outmaneuvered by other heavy tanks. So mobility overall, it's quite poor, but considering how strong and reliable the armor of this tank is, it's fairly justified. Next, let's get into the consumables and provisions. Of course, for this tank, I'd say use adrenaline, multi-purpose restoration pack, and then dynamic armor. While dynamic armor doesn't do much on this tank, 10% damage reduction is still useful, and it is undeniable that that gives you an advantage in terms of HP over enemies. Of course, also when you face higher penetration tanks such as tier 9s, activating this will help stop them from penetrating your upper plate. Another situation is if there are multiple enemies that you are facing and you can only face your hull front to one of them. Activating this will also help your upper plate to be strong to the enemy that is on your side. Just because, of course, with this tank being a pike nose, the angle which is not to your enemy will be weaker. Other than this, provisions, just normal for this vehicle. If you want to drop the small food for mobility, that's completely justified considering how slow this tank is. Also, one thing to note, horrible turret traverse speed, 17 degrees per second. That's the same as a mouse, and it is really slow, really noticeable in battle. This tank gets circled easily. So, equipment, I recommend gun rammer just because why would you use calibrated shells on a tank that has 290 millimeters of heat penetration? There is no point. This tank has very nice DPM alpha damage combination. Gun rammer really helps to take advantage of that and improve it, giving you an extra 115 DPM and half a second reload. You may think it doesn't sound like much, but it does make a difference in battle, and you also have just that very nice 340 alpha damage. It lets you trade against higher tier vehicles even. And of course, just with 290 millimeters of heat penetration, that is perfectly fine. That is enough to go through even very strong tier 9 tanks, since your penetration level really rivals tier 9. Next, defense system, just because improved modules is useless. Improved optics, of course, because this is a heavy tank, you don't need camo rating. Engine accelerator, because this tank is slow. While it does have poor traverse speed, it's not worth the increase just for traverse speed, because engine accelerator gives both your traverse and your acceleration a slight boost. Next, improved assembly or enhanced armor. Both of these can work, but I would say enhanced armor is more useful just because of how good this tank's frontal armor is. Using enhanced armor stops so many tier 8 tanks from being able to use their premium ammo against your upper plate. While improved assembly does work well because it gives extra hit points, and this tank has that dynamic armor so it can make its upper plate just fully impenetrable, I would say it's more useful to bounce tier 8 premium ammo without being forced to use your consumable. So that's why I've gone with enhanced armor. Of course, it also helps against low penetration levels on the turret front. Next, gun lane drive, of course, because this tank has good shell velocity on standard ammo, and most of the time you are using standard ammo. Also, just because this tank without enhanced gun lane drive is going to have a horrible gun. It's going to be so bad to use this gun without gun lane drive. Next, vertical stabilizer, because this tank has fairly mediocre on-move dispersion. Refined gun, not as useful for a heavy tank which has poor aim time, well, decent aim time but poor gun handling, and is really best in a close range brawling situation, which is where vertical stabilizer really is much better than refined gun, just because you don't need the better accuracy. And also you're just not sniping at long range in a heavy tank like this. Of course, toolbox, because this tank has good armor and can only take one repair kit due to having dynamic armor, and then consumable delivery system, just to be able to use consumables longer. If you did want to use high-end consumables, that does work. It increases the duration of dynamic armor up to 22 seconds from 17, but for me I like activating it more often in battle. But first gameplay will be on Castilla. Playing a lot of Castilla these days. But yeah, in this gameplay I'm going to go to the usual heavy tank side of the map, just because it's a very heavy based team for both sides, with 4 heavy tanks on each side. So here the Kyler is looking at me because this tank has just released, and also no news, no coverage about it. No contributors have got the vehicle, no one knew it was coming, and there's nothing in-game telling you that this tank is now available. So it is a bit of a sight to see in battle. But here, taking up a bit of an odd position, but it does work if the tanks do cross on that side. Now you'll notice the fences broke there. I didn't spot the enemy, so I'm wondering what happened, and the reason is it was not a heavy tank crossing, and of course as I push out the Caro decides to go, but oh well. I do manage to get a nice shot into him. I activate the dynamic armor just because my sides are exposed, and in this situation activating it will allow me to absorb more damage. Now notice there, this tank, the heat penetration, no issue going through the entire front of that CC-64, and the reason, well, despite him having a stock turret, the reason for that is just this tank has amazing heat penetration. 290 is 20mm more than really the average in tier 8, which makes it amazing. And yeah, why I didn't spot the tank that crossed, it was a tank destroyer, hence I wasn't able to see him. But now you'll be able to see this tank with its good DPM. I did sort of waste my adrenaline. It would be really nice to have in this situation, but you can still see that the DPM is good enough to be dealing with the situation I am in. Now this poor Tiger 2, he has the stock turret and gun. He's not even bothering to shoot me because he does not know where to shoot. He cannot penetrate me other than on the lower plate, and he's in too close range to be shooting that. So now the T-54E2 is alone against me and 2 other heavy tanks, so he's going to go down very shortly. But you can see this tank, great DPM. Despite there being 2 other heavy tanks with me, I am able to farm up the damage. Unfortunately the IS bounces, and now this Kyler is going to block my shot, so I can't finish this T-54E2 off. That was just a bad shot by me. And now I'm going to angle to this STG. He does bounce off because he has very low penetration, but this tank does also have some pretty troll angles when the turret is turned, just due to its really weird, almost hammer-like shape. But here you can see the poor mobility of the vehicle. It is very slow getting around, and it has no chance of chasing down medium tanks, even slow ones. But here, now, 2 tanks are spotted. The STG is going directly under this bridge, which just so happens to be where I'm going. And then the Action X I'm going to ignore for the moment and just try to kill this STG. So here you'll see this tank is very tall, so gun depression a bit awkward. You can't see it too much in these battles, but when I was playing this tank, it is very noticeable that this tank is huge with very bad gun depression. It makes it very awkward to use. I was trying to use it on the hill on mines, and usually tanks with 6 degrees of gun depression can somewhat use the hill on mines, but this one it really struggled just because it is so tall. So being tall, of course, more of your tank is exposed and your gun is sort of propped up a bit when you go up a hill. But that game, 1200 blocked. I would have blocked more if enemies had actually shot me, but the Tiger II just refused to shoot me because my armor was too strong. 3,400 damage roughly, a first class, because not many people have this tank, making 130,000 credits roughly. So, next battle is on Falls Creek. I don't have any gameplay against tier 9s, just because the games I had against tier 9s weren't that interesting or the best. And of course, this tank with its consumables and strong armor will be working the best against tier 8 tanks, obviously. However, that's not to say its armor is bad in tier 9. Its armor is still very, very good in tier 9 battles. You do just have to watch out for being penetrated in the turret a bit. So sitting still in this vehicle is not going to go well, just because you have multiple turret weak points against premium ammo. But here you'll see I'm pushing right down into the dip, just because I know I've got some pretty good DPM and good armor. Unfortunately, the CS63 rammed me for as much as I rammed him, and did manage to penetrate a shot. So, equal damage traded there. But you can see here, I've got the armor activated, and I'm blocking every shot from that Black Prince, which is premium ammo, and the CS53. Also, one thing to note, the Black Prince has very good premium ammo, so that's not just bad tier 7 penetration that I'm bouncing. But you can see, easily able to deal with that CS on my own, as this tank has good DPM, so no issues there. Again, another nice shot into the Black Prince, 340 damage, doing very well against these lower hit point tanks. One thing you will notice when you play this tank is that the combination of the nice alpha damage and DPM is very noticeable, as long as your accuracy isn't becoming an issue. So in close ranges, like in the previous battle with the Tiger II, you notice the DPM and alpha damage quite a bit, but at long range you won't, just because you're aiming in longer than you are reloading, which of course does lower your DPM a bit. But here you'll see I'm going to try and go to base A, hoping my team will be able to support. And you can see the mobility on this tank. It's slow. I'm not even really reaching my top speed. And I am slightly uphill, but you can still see how bad that mobility is. So, the Progetto 54 does bounce, which is nice. I didn't need to activate the armor there, but I did because I expected him to penetrate my lower plate, and it would have reduced the damage. Like you can see there, he did 260 instead of the usual 300. And then he does bounce again. One thing very nice about this armor, despite it having multiple turret weak points to premium ammo, despite it having the light on the front, which is a weak point, despite it having a weak lower plate, it is very nice that the lower plate is narrow and it's not large. It's wide, but it's not very tall. And you can also angle it just because it is a pike nose and the lower parts of it will bounce enemies. So the overall armor protection of this tank is actually very good. I should have been more, well, I should have noticed the battle ending with the victory points there, but I have music turned off in the game, so I wasn't able to hear the sound of the supremacy points counting up, and unfortunately I wasn't aggressive at the end of that. But again, you can see this armor, 2000 damage blocks for a fairly regular tier 8 battle. That is good blocked damage. 3400 damage again, pretty decent for this tank with its nice DPM, again making around 140,000 credits with a credit booster. So, Titan Strife, what is it like? I would say this tank is a good tank. However, it's very boring to play, it's not fun, it's fairly frustrating when the gun misses or you can't use gun depression, which is a lot of the time because of how big this tank is. So while it's a good tank, it's not very fun to play, but it's also not fun to play against just because its armor is so strong. It has got good DPM with good alpha damage, and it's quite hard to counter unless you know the weak points, which are of course the light and the lower plate. So it's going to be a bit annoying to play against, but it's also not all that fun to play. But yeah, definitely not a bad tank. It's definitely not worth gambling for in crates. Sorry about the sound, very windy today. Definitely not worth gambling in crates just because of how it's been released. 8,500 for a crate with a 5% drop chance. If you do want the other tanks, then yeah, it's worth trying, but not for multiple crates just because this tank itself isn't worth gambling 8,500 per crate for. But yeah, overall, pretty good tank, I would say. Not terrible, definitely, but nothing super amazing, and it's definitely a bit frustrating to play and to face against. But yeah, that is the Titan Strife. I'll have a review on the website later today, probably, and you can check that out there. Thanks for watching.